You should all know by now of the treasures you can find that reside in the rapid racking that makes up the North Shed. Thousands of artifacts and objects, stacked in no particular order, ready at a moment's notice to either be loaned, conserved, or used in the main part of the museum. The majority of the artifacts are obvious. Old telegraphs, model trains, and toys still in their boxes, and concept models used to show off. But for some objects, the railway connection isn't always that clear. I know. Why on earth does a railway museum have a prosthetic leg? No, this wasn't lost property. Although how you unknowingly lose a false leg astounds me. And no, this isn't some lost, confused relic that the Science Museum misplaced. This, would you believe, was actually designed and built by the Great Western Railway themselves. Even before Huskinson's death in 1830, you had to have nerves of steel, a strong stomach, and be prepared to be rather reckless when working on the railways. Safety was not at the forefront of everyone's mind, and the only focus were getting the job done. Long hours and tiring work made for costly and debilitating mistakes. In the United States alone, at least one in every 35 workers had some form of injury, and in the UK, there wasn't a day where the local surgeon wasn't called to deal with the fallout of a mishap. It got so bad that the railway bosses hired surgeons to live on site just to be on standby. Other than the occasional surgeon, the employers offered few other medical benefits, and even though surgeons were on site, they weren't free. Unlike many businesses, though, that didn't offer any form of health planning, the railways decided to take exception to this rule. In America, doctors became a part of the payroll, and the price for the doctor's fees would be equally shared and deducted from employee wages. Some workers hated the idea, with some not having seen a doctor in years. They felt that paying for others' mistakes and injuries was insulting, so some railways made the process voluntary, but added that those not willing to pay into the scheme would face the full charges of the doctor's bill. By 1896, over 98% of workers seeing the value opted in to the medical expenses. Because the railway was a relatively new thing, so was the accidents it caused and in turn the injuries. Doctors at the time had never seen injuries like the ones experienced and in turn how to treat them. But like with everything in the Victorian era, things moved very quickly and the doctors on the railway developed a unique style of surgery, especially those designed for these particular accidents. As the division grew, so did the specialism, and soon surgeons began to organise themselves into groups and divisions, and over time they would meet and share knowledge. The group became so well established that the National Association of Railway Surgeons was formed in 1888. Doctors would meet annually and discuss latest research and developments. Because of the distance between surgeries, these meetings were vital in saving lives. They even reached the ears of President Benjamin Harrison, who invited delegates to the first ever Pan-American Medical Congress in 1893. But their advancements were shunned by the wider medical community. They refused to recognise the railway surgeons' achievements because of their hiring methods. The railways preferred to use competition and contract bidding rather than the traditional interviews. It saved money on one hand, but it meant that the more expensive surgeons lost out. There was a practical denial of the entire practice. They were shunned at most standard medical councils and were even excluded from the major surgery textbooks. But the practice went from strength to strength, and the association expanded to include Canada and Mexico. The developments and contributions the surgeons made were life-saving. Just 50 years before, a severe injury such as Huskinson's, for example, would have spelt death within hours or an amputation, with severe chance of the patient passing due to either infection or shock. The surgeons would put on emphasis of how quickly can the surgery be done rather than care to do it right. This is true in that some prided themselves how quickly they could remove a limb. But with the introduction of anaesthetics and the better understanding of the human anatomy and infection, surgeons were able to treat the wounds with more care. They also could develop the first emergency packs. These were packs that were carried on every train that contained basic equipment for treating injury. It also included medicine, sterile dressings, and tools needed to treat injuries at the trackside. Some of the non-railway doctors objected. They advised that these tools were not effective in untrained hands. But there was an underlying rumble that these kits could see them out of a job. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad decided to go one better. In addition to the kits, they introduced the first hospital car. These cars would provide a surgery-style environment where a surgeon can stabilise a patient ready for hospital. Obviously the predecessors to the modern-day ambulances, these cars helped in getting the patient to a sterile environment quickly and ready for treatment. But while the US was thriving in this field, I think it's time to go back in time a bit and across the pond to Swindon. And let's find out about that leg. For context, Swindon Works opened in 1843, and with its opening, so came the workers, and with them came the disease. Families living in blocked terraced housing and communal water and sanitation facilities meant that infection was free to spread. Cholera and typhus were an almost daily occurrence, and although a vaccine had been developed for smallpox, it wasn't widespread yet. This, with the rise of accidents within the plant, were putting a massive strain on the doctors and the Great Western as a whole. The Great Western already had a similar payment system to the US railways when it came to medicine, but the workers at Swindon were excluded from this benefit. It didn't help either that when the railway boom burst in 1847, the Great Western was forcing to lay off workers at Swindon because of its lack of cash. But the Great Western had a heart and knew of its struggles the past and current workers faced. Most laid-off workers went to search for work elsewhere, but some remained, hopeful that Swindon could turn its fortunes around. Superintendent at the time, Daniel Gooch, wrote to the board outlining the situation and, in loyalty to those that stayed in the area, proposed a medical service. The subscription would be paid for by the workers of the plant, but the benefit would also extend to anyone that had worked there previously. For many struggling families, having free access to a doctor would be a blessing. The Great Western agreed, and in December of 1847, Dr. Stuart Keith Ray took up his first official posting in a cottage that the railway owned, where he lived rent-free and earned a salary of £30. From this posting, the Great Western Railway Medical Fund was formed. The membership was mandatory from every worker, and the price would depend upon the worker's marital status and the amount that they earned. In the decades after the formation, the fund took on its own division. It now had trustees to oversee the fund and was now a proactive body, not just in providing first aid and treatment where needed, but to lobby for better sanitation and improving safety both within and around the plant. Everything was considered: improved roads to decrease trips and falls, improving sanitation at drinking stations, and provisioning for indoor plumbing. Even what animals you kept was under review. There was even a keeper of the lime. Lime was used in many ways in this era, and one of them was a common household cleaner. In the late 1850s, there was a real threat that England could be invaded by Napoleon III, so the Great Western built an armoury and a drill hole for the soldiers to use in case of attack. But as the threat died down, there were calls to repurpose the hole into a hospital, especially as the track record for accidents at Swindon was not doing too great. The Great Western agreed with the proposal, and the first cottage hospital were born. There was a dispensary, waiting rooms, and a consulting room. Fees were increased slightly as a result, but the facilities were as state-of-the-art as they came, and it meant that workers wouldn't need to travel to be treated, and the gardens would be a perfect place to convalesce. The funds continued to expand, and more facilities for the workers were added. By the 1890s, there was now a swimming bath and washing facilities. Another house in the area, Park House, was converted into a fully functioning doctor's surgery, and living quarters at its peak serviced over 14,000 workers. The first prosthetics were made in 1878 when an employee lost both his legs under a train. The society managed to save his life, but they knew that they could do more. They asked the carriage and wagon department to make him a pair of artificial legs that were bespoke for him to use. They were so successful that other limbs were created. The fund also provisioned for an undertaker and a dentist. The health benefits was becoming its most powerful lure for workers, and many would take pleasure in them. By 1892, a new hospital opened to complement the cottage hospital. This hospital was grand and huge. It had everything the workers needed. The swimming pool could be converted into an event space and was occasionally used for roller skating. You could say that the hospital provided for both physical and mental needs for its patients, even providing hairdressing facilities and a qualified masseuse. The membership fund would provide for a range of facilities, but some parts were not for free. Artificial limbs, dentures and glasses all required a contribution from the patient, but the small payment was nothing compared to the level of care that the patient received, and the numbers showed. Thousands of people passed through the Great Western's doors. It was, however, the start of the National Health Service that put an end to the funding. The NHS took over the Milton Road Centre in 1948 before handing it back to the council in the 60s. It's still running today as a full health and leisure centre. The cottage hospital was also refurbished, still servicing the community as a community hall. As for the leg, we know who it belonged to. It belonged to a coupler called Mr. Dolphin. He worked at the London and North Western Railway and unfortunately met with a mishap that cost him his foot. Although he was with a different railway, the LNWR approached the Great Western to produce his new leg, and it was considered a moral obligation to compensate Mr. Dolphin for his accident. We know that he ended up in the lamp room at the New Street station, and that within 2 years he'd be back when his leg was in need of repair and maintenance. It's hard to say exactly why and how it ended up at the NRM. Likely it was a family heirloom, but the Railway Museum is more than happy to house its more unusual artefact. As for the railway surgeons and their use, their actions were recognised and they were eventually amalgamated into the general medical fold in the 1920s. There are a few references to them today, and they quietly slipped into obscurity. But like the Great Western buildings at Swindon's, their actions are recognised, especially in the first aid kits that we all now take for granted.